but also social institutions. And well, the NGO, environmental organization, started the lawsuit, and actually they won. And because actually one of the reasons why Shell left the Netherlands, because we had a headquarter in the Netherlands and in London. One of the consequences of that they lost the lawsuit was that they moved the headquarters to London. And then, of course, you can also imagine that, you know, we also have the Brexit. So that means that the Netherlands, but also the European Commission, has less influence on the behavior of an organization like Shell. Because now Shell has to deal with the British legislation. Another one is also really interesting, Unilever. We all know Unilever is also exactly the same with Shell, but also what we saw with the Unilever was that when Paul Polman was the CEO of Unilever, he started a sustainability strategy for Unilever, because he really believed that, you know, the company should change, that they also should take the different interests into account, and that we really have to make a sustainable footprint. He was successful in doing that, but not if you look at the return on investment. Because if you look at the shares, then actually the shares were a little bit declining compared to the competitors. So there was a lot of pressure from the shareholders by saying, wait a minute, this is not what we really like, because that's what we will see is that shareholders have a short-term orientation. And so they force Unilever also to change the strategy. So they couldn't implement their sustainable strategy as fast as Paul Polman had intention to do. And another discussion was also the headquarters. There was the combination. That was also the reason why Unilever left the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, we also have a huge discussion about farmers, about nitrogen. We have to reduce that. A lot of protests in the Netherlands. But also what we saw was that large organizations also started intervening in the whole situation, and in particular the dairy firms. And actually what they did was they also finance the protest organized by the farmers, so that they also should not well, adapt as fast as possible. Another one, it's also just to show some examples. Another example that we have from an other perspective is the electronic company Philips. You all know probably their company. The company started in lighting, then consumer electronics, and now it's a company mainly focused on health devices. But they also have an issue with sleeping equipment, particularly in the United States. But actually what we also see is that, you know, did this company behave in a responsible way? No, because they already knew that there were some issues with these equipments, but they didn't anticipate on that. And now what you see is that there are a lot of lawsuits against Philips. And so that means that they have to spend billions of euros for compensation. So there are a couple of well, interesting developments, but also if you look at the behavior organizations, this is not the behavior that we really would like to see for organizations. And so that's something that we also know that, you know, organizations have to change. There are a couple of reasons for that. Is that, you know, we could benefit from the globalization, but also what we see is that globalization also put some pressure on organization. Digitalization is also a very interesting one. We have the platformization. So how are we dealing with that? Social media. Well, one of the reasons why we know all these issues of these companies is that we have media, social media. Because nowadays, that's also something that companies should be aware of, is that, you know, if something happening, then within 5 minutes time, the whole world knows it. Before that, you know, it's really interesting is that if something happened, then, you know, someone, journalist has to write about it. Before it was the article sent to the newspaper, read by the audience, then, you know, well, probably 1 day later, 2 days later, it was in the news. And then the company could anticipate on that. But nowadays, with social media, you can't do it anymore. And that's also something that organizations should be aware of. And we saw that, for instance, with the Dieselgate, with Volkswagen, that the company didn't realize, the impact of social media on the organization. Because what we saw was that there was the issue, was released in the news, and actually they thought, okay, that's definitely not an issue. Well, we know how to deal with that with our PR, etc. But what happened actually was that, due to the social media, everyone started giving his or her opinion about it, and they couldn't stop it anymore. And so what you see is that also the environment for is changing, the organization operating in. And of course, but I don't have to explain that the climate crisis that we have, that we also see that the behavior of organizations have to change, the energy transition, etc. But also perhaps what's really also important is that most of us are not realizing is that digitalization is that if you nowadays look at organizations, in particular large organizations, they are becoming data companies. And what will they do with the data? Because with data, you have a lot of power, but you can also influence the behavior of others or force them. So that's also something that we should realize is that, how are we dealing with security, protecting the clients from the behavior of the large organizations. What I mentioned is that, and that's also what we see, is that, I mentioned digitalization, ICT plays a very important role, but also one of the consequences, what we have seen is that the number of NGOs, non-governmental organizations or non-profit organizations, has increased dramatically. And this is also really important because what we see is that, there are market failures, etc. And then we need these NGOs also to inform us, create public awareness, and inform us and to see if we can also change the behavior of the organizations. So what you also see is that NGOs plays a very important role also in informing us. But also that means also that given that it also they put a lot of pressure on organizations, and so that means organizations also have to change, or they at least the way they make decisions have to change. And this is also really nice is that we also did research on this phenomenon, and so we also look at legitimacy of NGOs. And actually, what we saw is from the 70s on that we saw that the wording NGO has increased, and the consequence of that is that the cognitive legitimacy also has increased of NGOs. So they are now legal, legitimized organizations, and so if they say something, put pressure on organizations, then we also accept that from these organizations. Something else what's also really important is, particularly also for you to understand what's going on in the Netherlands and also in Europe, is that organizations, they really try to maintain the competitive advantage. So and that's actually where they focus on. That's also what we saw with an organization like Shell. They knew that they also have to change. They knew the climate change. They knew the energy transition was coming. But if you then look at the interest of that organization, actually what we saw was that they focus more on the value maintenance than creating new value. Actually, focusing on the current activities, exploitation instead of exploration. Due to the pressure, we also saw that they were changing. But for a long time, what they actually did, they lobbied quite a lot in the Netherlands, European level, also with other governmental agencies. That they don't, it was not necessary for them then to change, or if they had to change, then to be in favor of the organizations. And so that also what you see is that when we have these subsidies. These particular programs for subsidizing these innovative activity organizations, then they were always in favor of these organizations. And most of the time, it's also really interesting, they were also the ones that, it's a kind of co-creation, also design the programs. And this is also a nice, this recently was in the news, the big tech companies. And also what I mentioned is that, we talk about the privacy, the data issue. And actually what we see is that they lobby quite a lot, also at the European level, so that they don't have to change their behavior, or at least the failure maintenance is very important. And to give you a little bit of idea about, the behavior of these organizations is that in the I don't know how it is in here in Colombia, but in the European Union, organizations are obliged to register if they are lobbying in the Netherlands, but also at the European level. So this is the registration transparency register of the EU. So all the companies that do some lobbying activities in the EU are on that list. But they also know how much money they are spending on lobbying. And to give you a little bit of idea about, what we see is that more than 80,000 people are lobbying in Brussels. And we only talk about Brussels. So that means that we are not talking about the lobbyists in The Hague in the Netherlands, or in Berlin in Germany, etc. So this is really only at the European level in Brussels, in Strasbourg. And so if you then look at full time, then it's 50,000. So it's really a huge number of lobbyists that we see in Brussels. And what's also really interesting is that if you look at the lobbyists, almost 7,000, they haven't passed to enter the parliament. So they don't need any permission, because they haven't passed, so they can enter in the parliament and start lobbying with all the politicians. Also, what is interesting is to know, if we talk about the lobbyists, how many lobbyists are lobbying for the small size companies? You say none? Do you have an idea of someone online? Yeah, 1 out of 20, sorry, 1 out of 50 is lobbying for the SMEs. No, there are. But that means that 49 are lobbying for the large organizations. And then if you look at, how many, what is the percentage of large companies in the EU? And so that means also for the other side, small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, in general, if you look at the distribution of small, medium-sized organizations versus large organizations. 1%? It's 5%. Yeah, 10. Okay, yeah, more nice, the average. Yeah, it's around 5%. So that means 95% are really the small size enterprises. So that's really interesting to know, isn't it? And if you then look at the workforce, 50, it's more or less distributed 50-50. So and that's the reason why these large organizations have a huge influence. But also what is really interesting then is that, so only 5%, but most of the lobbyists are lobbying for large organizations. And well, that's also what we see in our case, is that they have a huge influence, but also that we see that most of these large organizations are not really willing to change. And of course, they are willing to change as long as they can create a new competitive advantage. But it's really difficult if others are not changing. What we see, for instance, with the sustainability developments, is that for a long time it was not very profitable. compared to the current business. So that means they were really reluctant to make the transformation. And so, but we know that we have to change. And there's also something else that we have to know, is that, if you also look at the climate crisis, energy transition, also the sustainable development goals, that's something that we also have to realize, is that, where are our resources coming from? If you look at the companies like in the Netherlands, like companies like Shell, Unilever, etc., do we have enough resources in the Netherlands? No, probably not. Because what we know is that the resources are coming from elsewhere in the world. But if you look also at that, then the question is then also, based on, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals, are we really knowing exactly what's going in our supply chain? Are we really paying the fair price? How are we dealing with pollution, etc.? Well, then we know that we are not behaving in the way we think we have to do, based on the Sustainable Development Goals. So that means we have to change, but that also has huge consequences for us. And that's something that, we are saying that we should be aware of that. We should change the way we are looking at organizations, the way we have to look at the behavior of organizations. And we also know then that we learned in the COVID time, for instance, that, the world is actually a small boat. Fantastic citation from him, the former Secretary of United Nations, was saying that, we are living in a small boat, and, if one is becoming ill, we influence all others. And that's actually what we see in the world. And that's also, we are saying that we also have to change, because we all should realize this, that the world is changing. And that means that we have to rethink how we are dealing with profitability and responsibility. Because for a long time, we were really focusing on profitability. And we had, and of course, when we talk about responsibility, then I also have to say that, we are looking at responsibility as long as it's a win-win situation for us. And I have to say, and that's actually what we have seen in the Netherlands, but actually most part of in Europe, is that it started more or less in the 80s, that we became more Anglo-Saxon oriented companies. Before that, this perhaps also nice to know, is that if you look at the Netherlands, then we had we call it the Rijnlands model. So there was a lot of collaboration and decision making together with the government, labor unions, companies, etc. But we also had a long-term vision, most of the organizations. And that also has to do with our shareholders, because we had the institutional shareholders. And well, these institutional shareholders were very important for our pension. And so they had a really long-term orientation, because they had to pay the pensions for the next generations. So for them, it was really important to look at the organization, not the behavior of the organization in the short term, but in the long term. No, is the company able to create value for the long term? So that was the orientation in the Netherlands. But actually, what we have seen, it started in the 80s, that we changed that perspective. Legislation changed, institutional shareholders were allowed to change their behavior. They were allowed to invest more in shares of companies before that, because they also had to invest in obligations, etc. And they also started to influence, affected by short-term thinking. And also what we then saw also that the executive board of organizations were more or less accountable for the short-term profits and not for the long-term perspective anymore. So there we saw a change in the Netherlands. But also what we saw also was, and that's also a really interesting development, is that we saw that we really stimulate mobility. So we believe that mobility is very excellent. So that will definitely help the organization. So what we saw is that, you know, if you look at the members of the top management teams, the executive board, most of the time they were sitting for 5 years. Then they left the company and moved to another company. But what is the consequence of that is that actually what we saw was that, and that we also introduced a reward system. And the reward system was that, you know, the salary of the top management team was related to the profitability of the organization. And so what we saw was that due to the short-term tenure of these CEOs, actually they were focusing on short-term profits. And well, probably you know that, you know, if you focus on operational profits, that's quite easy because you sell assets and that counts as a profit for that particular year. So that's actually what we saw. And actually what we also saw was that we didn't have anymore a long-term orientation as the organizations. And that's really important that you at least know your strategic intent. Where would you like to move to? We lost that because it's changed all the time based on the new CEO. So that was also the developments that we saw. And the consequence was also that, you know, we focus more on profitability than on responsibility. So what's really important, actually what we saw is that we had the Rhinelands model. What I mentioned is that collaboration, some call them also the third way. We focus more on the transaction cost. And if you look at the transaction cost, I really like it, the transaction cost, but also explain, because actually it was one of the first to explain the organization, the way we know the organization, but also the size of the organization. But if you look at the transaction cost, then it's really economic oriented. But if you then go to organizations, and that's actually what I always do when I ask my students, they ask, the first thing is, well, if you like to start your company, what is your main purpose? Is that to become rich? Most of the time it's not. Because, you know, there's something that you think I can contribute to. And if that is successful, then you will become really enthusiastic and say, you know, you have an idea, you can come up with an innovation. Hey, wait a minute. With the innovation, we can produce a particular product or deliver a particular service. If you are able to do that, then of course, you can start earning from it. First of all, you are very happy if you can pay your own salary. You have a living out of that. And if it's become more successful, then, you know, you will see that, you know, others, you start employing others, and you will increase in size as an organization. But what is really important is you start with it's my mic, isn't it? That's okay. It's over again. Just like yesterday, thunderstorm. So now we also have a thunderstorm here. I think it's fine now. Whoa, no.
In technology, fine.
We can also switch this off, or are they not able to hear me? Okay, can you hear me now? Excellent. So what's really important is that you start an organization because you believe in something. You have an idea. And related to that, there's always some norms, values related also. Because that's the way you start with something. And actually, when we look at these large organizations, and also when we look at the high mobility of the top management team, actually what we have seen is that they lost the identity of the organization. They lost, you know, the reason why the organization started to exist. And that's really important to realize. Because nowadays, because we are living in in dynamic world, you need the identity of the organization, because the identity helps you to steer in the dynamics and to achieve your strategic intention. So that's really important, and that's also something that what we have seen in most of our organization is that we are struggling with identity. And then, of course, they are sitting there and they come up with, oh, well, perhaps this should be our identity, or etc. But also relate to the identity is the norms of values. So most of the time also what we see is that these CEOs don't know the fundamental values anymore of the organization. So what you see is that they become more profit organizations, focusing on profit making entities. So what is really important, and the main questions that we have, and that's also what we like to address, is who are our stakeholders? Because nowadays, most of the time, if you look at organizations, then they look at the stakeholders as suppliers, clients, and we even have this slogan that, you know, the client is the customer is king. But it's a very important one. But are there other stakeholders, competitors, employees? And what about other stakeholders? I just mentioned this. Are we taking these stakeholders into account when we make the decisions as an organization? What is our philosophy? And that's also really important. What is if you look at in Colombia, what is the philosophy? How are you looking at stakeholders? Yeah, so multiple value creation. Yeah, so that's the way you are looking at it. And are you then, for instance, taking into account Ubuntu? So that's the African way of looking at how to manage organizations. That means that you also take into account ancestors. So what happened in the past, the history, you also respect that. But you can also take into account, you know, next generations. And that's also a really interesting one. This is also the way we are looking at stakeholders and the interests of stakeholders. So that's one. Another one is a really interesting one. I'm also curious about, you know, how this is in Colombia. But if you look at the form of the organization, the size of the organization, well, are there adequate forms to deal with the new challenges?
And here we have a lot of informal organizations, not registered, basically like owner, manager, very small, like micro enterprises. And people that are not contributing to the health system and not like saving money for retirement. Like we have a lot of informal organizations, and it adds to the complexity of issues of organizations, and then also like problem.
But I guess also, so there are also a lot of informal work systems within formal organizations. Actually, I guess this university sometimes works better through its informal systems than through its formal systems.
Yeah, and that's also really interesting to see the difference between, let me say, the European companies and the companies from Latin America, because we are more formalized. The red tape democracy, we have a lot of rules and we stick more or less to the rules. Here we know it's more informal. So that means also, you know, how should the organization form look like? But if I look at the Netherlands, for instance, or the more Western companies, then what we are saying, consolidation is very important, economies of scale and scope. We see that, for instance, in hospitals in the Netherlands, that, you know, we would really would like to see consolidation of hospitals, because we believe that we are able to reduce the cost. But in reality, it's not happening. Actually, the costs are increasing, and the services that are provided are not better than having more small hospitals. So we have an issue with size, but also what we see is that if you look at the top management team of these organizations, do they really know what's going on in the organization? Probably not. Actually, we also see that in our university, is that, you know, if you look at this executive board, we don't see that many times the executive board members in our schools. And this is also happening with most of the organizations. They are not walking around, so they don't know exactly what's going on in the organization. So the way to manage these organizations is to use KPIs, key performance indicators. But then the question is, not all the KPIs you can use for all these different subsidiaries of the organization. So there are differences, but it's quite easy for the top management team to use the same KPIs for all the organizations. So we also did research on that. And actually, we force managers of subsidiaries to behave according to these KPIs, but it was not possible for them. So they also gave some mismatch within the organization. But also what's really important is, how are we dealing with the challenges? Value creation, social value creation, ecological value creation. How are we how can we measure them, identify them, measure them, and put them in KPIs? Oh, probably. We don't know it now. We are still looking for measurements, how to measure that, etc. So that's really a big challenge. But also, if you look at employees, we more or less employees are numbers. So that the main question actually is that, you know, if you look at these organization forms, well, probably they are not adequate anymore with the challenges that we have to deal with. And then, of course, another one is, how are we looking at organizations? And yesterday we had a very interesting class with Bart. And then we had also a discussion about, you know, how are we looking at organizations? And, well, you know this. Actually, what we've seen is that, you know, if you look at most of the time, Western companies, let me particularly emphasize the Dutch companies, they focus more on the self-interest, profit maximization, and once in a while we are doing good for others. Corporate social responsibility. It's not really embedded in the organization. What is really needed, I would say, as stakeholder management, we are also doing that, but then the question is, you know, who are our stakeholders? Are we really taking the interests of all the stakeholders into account? Are we really creating a win-win situation of everyone? At least Pareto optimal. No one should be worse off when we make decisions. Well, we are not doing it. But actually, that's something that we can should expect from organizations. But also, and that's a discussion that we have, also, for instance, think about pollution, is contracts. Organizations consist of contracts, formal, informal contracts. If you have a contract with, and that is something, you are the community allows you to build a plant in that community. You have a contract, but I believe that in none of the contracts is written down that you are allowed to pollute the ground. How are we dealing with that? Well, we don't have a mechanism for that. But there's something that we should realize, that, you know, if you have a contract, you also would like to see that everyone respect the contract. And that's also what we expect. So that's also something that you can expect from organizations. So if you take that perspective a little bit more, then you know that you also have to change your behavior, in particular organizations from the West. And then you can have a discussion, and it was really interesting yesterday, stakeholder stewardship. And that's also what you can discuss about. Do we believe, or are we convinced that organizations should also contribute to the solutions, to come up with solutions for problems in the world? we can debate about this. I don't know the right answer, but for me, what's really important is that at least the contract theory, and that's is already an old theory. And Clark in 1916 already wrote about it.
Companies already 50 years old, especially when they're located in rural area. And they are taking care of public needs. And actually, today in the newspaper, there was a news article on an energy oil company that deals with rights activities because the neighbors were reclaiming the pavement of a road. The company, but it goes far beyond their capacity to respond to this need. And the government didn't respond to it either, so their operation was blocked already for 2 months.
Yeah. So you are a little bit more to the stakeholder stewardship, isn't it?
That's in emerging.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very important.
And we block up the investments that we use groups and they all work together to develop the social and to maintain the habits. And why is that? In business communities are not really when people want to develop a social or any other and that is specifically to work wonderful job for everyone. At the end, you are able to provide the right incentive. You are going to make this type of initiative happen. Of course, I have to say that this is just a special case. It doesn't really happen in the or I don't know. My knowledge is not good.
Yeah, but also given the context, it's what you see is that organizations have also a different behavior, or showing different behavior. And that's and can also change. That's actually also what we have seen in the Netherlands, for instance. I mentioned Shell, I mentioned Philips. Actually, these companies were also at the beginning very social because they not only produced the products, but they also had programs for the employees, education programs, sport facilities were offered, scholarships were offered, etc. And that also has changed. Even when I was a PhD student, I also received a scholarship from Shell. And a few years later, they decided to stop with that. They also see that, in the 80s, 90s, also these organizations also changed. What I mentioned there, that first they also had these, well, what is it? A little bit more the stewardship, also helping the others. Also in the interest of the organization, that was a win-win situation because the better the employees were educated, the more benefit the organization could have based on R&D. Also, the health situation was also very important. So insurance were offered by these companies, etc. You don't do it anymore. So there you also see that also when we talk about multiple value creation, actually we focus more only on the economic value creation. So that's also important to realize. And we can really learn a lot also from you. And that's something different than you may perhaps expect, because most of the time we are looking at these financially successful organizations, etc. They also have a great contribution, but now with the new challenges, the current challenges, we really have to change our behavior. We have to organize differently. And so, actually, what we are saying is that perhaps we should see organizations as families again, because if you look at a family, then, and what is really important is that, most of the things that happen in the business world, you can easily relate it to a family. With families, think about, making alliances for organizations, companies make alliance with other companies or public-private partnerships, etc. But you also do that as a person in your family, with friends, etc. Acquaintance. What kind of alliance setup do you have, etc. So if you look at that perspective, then you can also apply that more or less also to the organizations and to see, also the consequences of your behavior, etc. So what we are saying now is that there are a couple of things that perhaps are really important that we should take more into account. First of all is that, we have to look at the role of supervisors, of the CEOs have to change. We should go more supervisors, educators. That's different than what we have now, because they are running the organization. They are not really supervising you and not educating you. No, they are only looking at, the network, more or less the profitability, strategy, goals of the organization, etc. So that's something that is also really important to take into account. But also what's really important is that CEO stands for the identity of the organization, because they are the ones that send it out, communicate it. But also not internal, but also external. So that's really important. But that means also, based on the identity of the organization, they also should have make a link between organizational teams and societal teams. There's also, if I go back again to our situation, we look at our founders of the large organizations. And actually what's really interesting to see is that most of the times that these founders, they're also active in politics. They also had an opinion about it. They also would like to had the intention to influence it to make it better. And that's also really interesting. How many CEOs are now really involved in that? Not that many anymore. So that's also really important that, they also should change the behavior, but also the mindset. So, and make them also responsible and accountable also for societal teams. Because if you think about the social contract theory, then you know that they also are responsible. Explicit, implicitly, they are. Of course, they have to contribute to the debates, but also what's really important is that transparency. Well, at least that's something that we have seen is that transparency is very important. Everything should be disclosed, salaries of the CEOs, etc. But actually what we have seen is the following. First we thought, okay, if we make everything public, then what we see is that these salaries will not increase anymore. But actually what happened was that because we make it public and you were on a golf court and you were playing with one of your peer, he had a smaller company, you see, when a smaller company will earn more than you. The first thing that happened was that they went back to the supervisory board and told them, wait a minute, my salary has to increase. So actually we saw a negative externalities of transparency. And that's also what you have in families. You don't make everything transparent to the outside world, because some things you keep in the family. And that's also something that, that's a kind of paradox. It's very good to be transparent, but we also should realize that it also has negative externalities in it. Then, well, we are also saying that, based on KPIs, etc., we are losing trust. And what's really important is trust is really important. Also in the family, once in a while, you also have to trust someone. For instance, if my kids are going out, then I trust them that they behave in a certain correct way. If not, then of course you will intervene, but normally you trust them. It's impossible to go out with them and monitor their behavior all the time. This is also important for organizations. So that means you have to reduce the KPI focus and increase trust again. But it also has to do with the philosophy of life. How are we looking at the organization? How are we looking at our stakeholders, etc. And also what's really important is, if you look at the large organization, also the role of the CFO is also in the Netherlands really focused on financial aspects of our business operations. We may also expect for them, if we approach, we will have a more holistic approach, that they also will have a more holistic approach. They also should take other aspects into account when they are controlling and planning all the business operations. So based on that, so we came up with a couple of recommendations. First of all, what's really important is that, organizations, in particular top management team, should be more proactive in responsibility, but also in accountability. So it should be on the agenda all the time of the top management team. And not once in a while. Not for value creation, but also if you look at the stakeholders, and that's also really important, is that take all the stakeholders into account, but also look at their interests based on dignity, respect, and fairness. And if we already do that, then we already are more or less coming close to fulfillment of our sustainable development goals, if we are doing that. It's actually quite simple to do, but it seems hard in reality. But of philosophy, life, social context, and also I didn't mention that, but that's also really important, is that you have to see when you make decisions, always make the decision within system approach, integrative approach. So if you make a decision, that you always have to anticipate on what's coming, what are the consequences of others, etc. And if you do that, then you can relate that to dignity, respect, fairness, responsibility, accountability. So always take it from a system integrated approach. And finally, and that's also we thought, okay, it also perhaps it's good to have a philosopher in the executive board. And that's also really interesting, because we are in other society than, for instance, in the Netherlands. Because actually what we see in the Netherlands is that if you look at a religion, there are not so many people religion anymore. So we see we have two main religions, the Catholic and Protestant. And what we see in both, the number of people are believing is declining dramatically. I think, what is it? It's still 5% or something like this going to the church. Yeah, and I think around less than 50% is still a religion person, and others not anymore. This is also really interesting, because actually what you will see is that if you also look at philosophy of life, and well, we have to deal with complex situations, ethical issues. How are we relating that to our decision making? And actually what we see is that most of the decision makers are really struggling with that. And so we see also some alternatives. So that now, for instance, priests are not not standing anymore in the church, but are consultants. So they are really advising the top management teams making decisions. And yeah, to deal with these current challenges, but also, for instance, if you have to reorganize, you have to fire people, it's also really difficult to do. Because it's quite easy to say, we have to focus on the rational, we have a rational approach, we will fire, let me say, 10,000 people, but most of us are not able to do that. Because, it's not only 10,000 people that you will fire, but there are also families behind. And what you then see is that people really struggle with that. And what we also know is that quite a lot of the top management teams are using alcohol or drugs. So that's one of the reasons why the clinics are quite booming, because they really struggle with ethical issues. And with a lot of work pressure, so they are looking for alternatives. And so that's the reason, perhaps maybe really interesting to have a philosopher, and also to help them making the responsible decisions. So this is, well, based on the research that we have done, Frank Hartman and I, he's from accounting. So he had an accounting perspective. I had a strategic management perspective, and combined with the philosophy that we have at our university. And we also have a philosophy of life plays a very important role. Responsible organization. Based on that, we came up with this essay. So, and perhaps again to emphasize, we can learn a lot from you, more than you realize. Because we became so rational, and you are managing, organizing things differently. And actually, what you see is that most of the recommendations that we have, I think they are quite normal for you, isn't it?
Maybe tomorrow we have a presentation of the art group. Ask the external artist, to do some research about us and to make an artwork of our identity. And that will be released tomorrow, and it connects very much to this because I guess what we're looking for, that someone externally will strengthen our more informal connection, have a symbol of our informal connection. As a group of people that care about working together as part of this organization, above the formal and bureaucratic structures and formal organizational structures. And so it would be, I'm thinking, I know a bit about the work that you made, but you will have one called this art of identity. But is it one identity? Does it need to be one identity? And then you have in this new business model, then you have more identity in one organization.
Yeah, there's a literature about it, about organizational identity. And what we see is that within particular large organizations, you see different organizational identities. So it's possible. But then the question is, how are they connected to each other? And perhaps that's something that's really important, to find the connection. And actually, I also did research at our university, because perhaps it's good to know that our university was a Catholic university. And then they decided, together with wisdom, you should not be in the Catholic university anymore. And now we are struggling with the identity. Well, it's sustainability, our identity. Before that, it was more clear. I have to say that the Pope intervened half a year ago, and the Pope told us, you are still in Catholic university. That's really interesting to know. But it's also really important to know is that based on our identity, all our programs, they at least have a course in philosophy, philosophy of life, and that's really important. Also based on identity of the university. But then, if you look at our school, it's really interesting that we have in our school 5 different organization identities. And that's also once in a while a struggle. Schwartz knows it. But form something, an organization identity to collaborate with each other to achieve a purpose. We all have the more or less the same purpose, but because we are not forming the identity together, we are not all the time achieving it in collaboration. Other schools, they have it, because I have go to the law school, for instance. And so we also did research over there. And actually they say, oh, well, this is our identity. All the employees we're clear about it. So yeah, you have it. And I can show you the source. It's very interesting. Other questions also? Oh, okay.
He was just supporting the mission. Member of the system corporations are also in research.
Which price, I guess, one of the higher purposes is given then type of identity.
But I would say that, you know, now I'm a teacher again. And that's something that I would say is really important from to look at your side, and that is, it's fine if you look up to the Western society and the companies, but actually we can learn a lot from you. So try to also to the way you organize it, manage things, the way you are dealing with sustainability, the portfolio creation. Write it down, present it to us, and also try to influence our behavior. And that's really important because the way you organize it is completely different than we are doing. And together we can contribute to a better society. And perhaps, as you know, I'm from the Western part, so that means English is very important. We have really focused on the American way of doing research, etc. Perhaps it's really important if you do research, also try to write it in English. Because not everyone is reading speaking Spanish, because it's a huge community. But what we see is that for now, the main theories are coming from the Western part. You can contribute, but try to write it down in English. And then you can definitely have impact.
Thank you very much, Hans.
You're welcome.
Thank you to those of you still on Zoom. I will finish the recording and the meeting now. Thank you.